This is described as where the copper grew on the mountain. It's my understanding that it's the only place in the world where copper was like that, where it could be mined on the surface. We have stories within our community that we as a people use copper. And we traded copper up and down the Mississippi for other goods. So it was part of our lives.
There was this mass copper that you could find at that time, sticking out from the shoreline and from deposits along the mid-rib of the Keweenaw Peninsula.
On the Keweenaw Peninsula, which juts into Lake Superior, is located the most important deposit of native copper ever found.
It wasn't until 1842 that it was a copper land rush. Everybody ran into here to set up claims to try and find copper and to begin exploration. In total, around 140 mines were set up. They discovered that they could actually consistently get more copper out by pounding, smashing the basalt, and that's why we call them stamp sands. The copper was only 1 to 2% of the rock, so 97% of what came out were these stamp sands. We know that they discharged 22.7 million metric tons of stamp sands. If you were loading up railroad cars, they would stretch all the way to San Diego.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for that opening video. More on that to come. As someone who grew up in the Great Lakes, I've learned a lot just by watching that. So excited to share more with you. I am excited to welcome all of you to the ESIP January meeting. I am Susan Shingledecker, ESIP's Executive Director. Over the next 4 days, we have 300 of the world's leading earth science data professionals gathered together to share, showcase, and advance our work in over 30 sessions, 27 posters, and 4 networking events. I want to especially welcome our 96 first-time attendees. We hope that you will find the ESIP community a professional home full of amazing people who want to help you advance our work together. For those of you who are ESIP regulars, there is no shortage of new connections to be made this week. Please join me in welcoming all to our meeting and to the ESIP community. While I know we were all hoping for an in-person gathering, the safety and well-being of our community is paramount. Please know that our team is committed to continue to deliver the most engaging online meetings possible. I want to introduce the ESIP team and have them turn on their cameras briefly. Each meeting space will have at least one ESIP staff member at all times. Please allow me to introduce our team. We have Megan Carter, ESIP's Community Director and mastermind behind much of our meeting technology this week. We have Patty Allen, ESIP's Operations Director and in charge of registration and plenary support. We have Annie Burgess, ESIP's Lab Director and lead on networking spaces. We have Allison Mills, ESIP's Communication Manager and social media lead. And we have Lindsay Barbieri, ESIP's Agriculture and Climate Fellow and lead on cross-cluster collaboration opportunities. In addition to this incredible team, we have our new class of ESIP Community Fellows who are helping us behind the scenes in breakout rooms and in the KikoChat help desk space. Feel free to reach out to any of us with questions at any time. You can use chat in Zoom or in KikoChat. You can use the ESIP Slack space, or you can email us at staff@esipfed.org. Our theme for 2022 is data for all people, from generation and use to understanding. As our opening plenary panel shared with me, data should be for all, not just people, but all the air, the water, the land, the plants, and all life. I really appreciate this mindset. In that spirit, it is my honor to share with you a land acknowledgement as we open this meeting. I want to recognize and honor those Indigenous people, Native Americans, American Indians, and others who have stewarded our land, our water, and our planet long before our arrival. In many cases, they were removed from their lands by the forces of colonization and white supremacy. The ESIP team works remotely on land we today refer to as Maryland, Virginia, New York, Montana, Michigan, and Vermont. So I want to especially acknowledge the Piscataway, Nanacoke, Susquehannock, Manahoac, Munsee Lenape, Cheyenne, Salish Kootenai, Absaloke, Wabanaki, Abenaki, and Anishinaabe nations and their peoples who have lived on and stewarded these lands long before us, are here with us today, and will be into the future. We are grateful for their wisdom and practices. I encourage each of us to search for ways we can bring our work to serve and honor all. Thank you. As we gather, I want you all to feel that ESIP is a safe, welcoming, and supportive place. ESIP is guided by our community participation guidelines. These were provided for you at registration and can be found in the notes, documents, and PicoChat in each and every ESIP space you are in this week. If at any time during our meeting or in your work with ESIP, you feel these guidelines have not been followed, I ask you to bring the matter to my attention or any member of the ESIP staff. You can also use our third-party reporting system so that we can investigate the matter fairly. It is now my pleasure to introduce you to Ken Casey, ESIP's president.
Thank you, Susan. And thanks for getting our January meeting off to a great start with your thoughtful land acknowledgement. Hello, everyone. My name's Ken Casey. I'm the deputy of the Data Stewardship Division at NOAA's National Centers for Environmental Information, and it is my great honor to serve as the ESIP president. I'm just finishing my first year in the role, and I'm thrilled to have been elected to a second term for 2022. Serving in this role has given me the opportunity to see from a new perspective this wonderful organization and community, which I really fell in love with all the way back in 2003. Working so closely with the ESIP team and the volunteer leaders over this past year, I can tell you that ESIP is in the best of hands. While the rest of the world may feel chaotic, out of control, and full of strife, ESIP is truly thriving. That vitality comes straight from all of you, the ESIP community, and I thank you all for your continued engagement during these challenging times. So let's keep the momentum rolling this week. Turn on those email autoresponders, block off your calendars, and tell your bosses it's ESIP time. Ask lots of questions, introduce yourself to some of these new faces, and explore new ideas and new ways of thinking. And to echo Susan's words, please do it all in the respectful, welcoming, and supportive manner that our community expects and is encoded in the community participation guidelines. So without further ado, it is my pleasure to welcome our opening plenary speakers, Dr. Stephanie Rousseau-Carroll, Emily Shaw, Kathy Smith, and Dr. Val Gagnon, along with Dr. Gagnon's students from her National Resources Policy class, which meets at this time, and they're all joining us via their live YouTube stream. So over to you, plenary speakers.
So each of our speakers, you can go ahead and unmute yourselves really quick and we'll pin your video.
Stephanie, can you lead off our introductions, followed by Emily, Kathy, and then Val, I believe.
Sure. Sidak Atna Kastan, Sidak Stephanie Carroll, Tishistas Landag Nalchina. Hello, I'm Stephanie Carroll. I'm Atna. from the native village of Clutica along the Copper River in Alaska. I'm also of Sicilian descent, and I'm here respectfully at the University of Arizona on the land of territories of the O'odham and Yaqui people.
Hi all, good morning. My name is Emily Shaw. I am a settler scientist working in Northern Michigan at Michigan Technological University.
Bujun in the way Maganaglu, Wasa no de que Nijinikas, Maingin Indo Dam, Nishanabe que Indau, Indanoke, Indawa, Glifwick, Wakwe Dung, in Dunjaba. Minogijib, my name is Kathleen Smith. I'm a tribally enrolled member with the Kuna Bay Indian community located in the beautiful Upper Peninsula of Baraga, Michigan. I work for Glifwick out of northern Wisconsin, located on the Bad River Indian Reservation, Miigwech.
Ani, Uzu, everyone. Good morning. My name is Val Ganyu, and I am of Korean, British, Irish, and Scottish descent. I live and work here in Upper Michigan, which are the ancestral and also contemporary homelands of the Ojibwe people, and in particular, the Keweenaw Bay Indian community. It's great to be here with all of you.
All right, so Stephanie, I'll bring up your slides and then we'll have you take it away.
Fantastic, thank you. Welcome everybody, we're excited to be here today with you. I'm just going to start talking while you're loading up those slides. So next slide, please. I'm going to begin by sharing some of the work of Dr. Dominique David Chavez, who developed the scale of levels of Indigenous community engagement and research to assess for how researchers access Indigenous knowledge systems and how they engage with the communities and community members who maintain those systems. So this is adapted from participatory agricultural research framework, and it's based on who holds authority and governance in the research process, ranging from no engagement representing extractive practices of research to self-determined Indigenous-led processes. So click, please. Applied to a global systematic review analyzing 20 years of climate studies that included Indigenous knowledges in their research, Dr. David Chavez found that 87% of the studies were extractive, representing colonial legacies. Click again. Yet there were a handful of studies as well as numerous grassroots community efforts that live on the self-determined end of the scale. How can researchers, repositories, funders, and other institutions support the shift to self-determined community-engaged science? One important way is through changing data relationships. Next slide, please. Indigenous data sovereignty is the right of Indigenous peoples to govern their data from collection and storage to use and reuse. Indigenous data sovereignty is a responsibility, an expression of the ways, traditions, and roles that communities have for the care and use of their knowledge. Next slide, please. Indigenous nations, like many other governments and institutions, create and enact data policies and practices that align with their values and knowledge systems. So these activities of Indigenous data governance are means of implementing greater Indigenous data sovereignty. Over the past 5 years, there have been scholarship as well as frameworks and principles for Indigenous data governance at various levels, including international for First Nations in Canada, which were enriched, and Maori and Aotearoa, New Zealand. Next slide. In response to the increased generation and use of data in open data, big data, open science, and research environments, and the limited opportunities for Indigenous control, the Global Indigenous Data Alliance, or GIDA, released the CARE principles, which are collective benefit, authority to control, responsibility, and ethics, and their sub-principles. So these principles set forth critical considerations for non-tribal data creators, stewards, and users, and are designed to guide the inclusion of Indigenous peoples in data governance and increase their access to data. Next slide. The CARE principles bring a people and purpose orientation to data governance, which complements the data-centric nature of the FAIR principles. So the FAIR principles seek to increase data sharing, and implementation of the CARE and FAIR principles together should be seen as necessary to allow Indigenous peoples to govern, access, and use their data and to share on their own terms. Next slide. Currently, the vast majority of Indigenous data including Earth observations, are neither FAIR nor CARE. Indigenous collections and data can be hard to find. They can be buried in larger collections or data sets, repositories, individuals' possessions. Indigenous data are often mislabeled. They don't indicate the Indigenous peoples who are related to those data, and they're not searchable. Indigenous peoples largely are not the legal rights holders. Thus, Indigenous collections and data are not fair and do not perpetuate Indigenous provenance, protocols for use and sharing, or permissions. Next slide. So we're really concerned about implementing fair and care on already existing data, as well as instituting policies and practices to operationalize fair and care in the ongoing creation of new data. Some of the tools to make this a reality include using Indigenous people's own laws, policies, and practices, and investing in Indigenous data systems. Also, updating other governments and institutions' policies and practices is another necessary step toward ethical inclusion of Indigenous knowledge in external data systems. Next slide. So really the goal is to create law, policy, and ethics and infrastructure that support, next slide, please, that support Indigenous data rights throughout the data lifecycle and across the data ecosystem, and to strengthen such rights by making changes, even minimal at first, across data actors such as research institutions, repositories, and publishers, funders, and more. So there's no one-size-fits-all approach to implementing Indigenous data governance. However, with that in mind, I highlight some key responsibilities and recommendations for enhancing data governance practices and for incorporating more equitable and just frameworks into data policy and practices. So some of the ways to build care principles into data policy and platforms include enriching metadata, so provenance, permissions, attributions, protocol, recognizing Indigenous intellectual property through appropriate authorship and acknowledgement, protecting both personal and community level identifier information, formalizing voluntary guidelines. I want to highlight the work that the East Repositories Group has been doing to figure out how to implement fair care and trust within repositories, and then to track data use and reuse. So thank you very much.
Wonderful. Thank you, Stephanie. Emily, you're up next, so I'll pull up your slides.
Great, thanks. It's just pictures on the first slide, so I'll just go ahead and begin. As I said in the brief introduction before, my name's Emily Shaw. I am many things, including a new gardener and a new jam maker, although I've always eaten both veggies and jam and enjoyed it. And my role as a researcher, I'm a PhD candidate at Michigan Technological University, and I am doing research into chemical contamination in fish. And this work is a part of a research partnership with the Keweenaw Bay Indian Community Natural Resources Department. And my work is looking at mixture toxicity and that comes from fish consumption, and that is the toxicity that comes from exposure to multiple contaminants simultaneously. Next slide, please. In addition to all of those things, I am a sister, partner, daughter, and I want to take a moment and explain why I do introductions in this way. It identifies some context, some positionality, who I am, how I see the world, and who I'm responsible to. It also can do some work to establish trust through the internet. Since I can't see most of your faces, you can at least know a little bit about me. And it also reveals specific lenses. So myself and many other scholars reject the idea that our research is objective or neutral. We have our own lenses, our own perspectives that inform the questions we ask and who we listen to as scientists. Next slide, please. And so I'd like to take a moment to introduce some work that has been a part of some ongoing work that's a part of my dissertation. As I mentioned previously, I am in a research partnership with KBIC. And in response to some inquiries from outside researchers and evaluators, the tribe worked to create a research guidance document. And there was a committee put together. They've been working on this since 2018. And when they presented their preliminary results to tribal council, the council asked for more information. And that's where I came in with my dissertation. Next slide, please. I B, I did a survey of the literature, found out what other tribal nations were doing, and what we came up with is what we're calling our seasons of research with, by, as the Keweenaw Bay Indian community. And I'd like to take a moment here and just offer some explanation for the with, by, as. That comes from Maori scholar Nan Waipehana's work that evaluated relationships between scientists and the community. And on the spectrum of positionality, 2, 4, with, by, as research is the only research that's invitational. Myself and other settler scholars, we can't make an assumption of involvement. We don't have a place there unless we're invited by the community. And for this reason, and research in this way is beneficial and impactful, not extractive and harmful, as Stephanie was talking about earlier. Next slide, please. And so from that sketch on the previous slide, some work by the floral designs by Rose Edwards and the design work by Kayla Fond, the work from Val and Evelyn and myself was able to become this beautiful research guidance. We used the medicine wheel, since it's a practical concept already in use, as a way to show interconnected systems of teaching. And so within a research context, we begin here in the East with relationship building, and we move through the seasons of research, planning and prioritization, knowledge exchange, synthesis, and application. And the momentum through these seasons carries us back to the beginning, so to speak, back to relationship building. And this medicine wheel is a framework for shared responsibilities between all collaborators. Next slide, please. And so that, what I just showed was the inside of this trifold pamphlet. This here is the rest of the information. This pamphlet was designed to be available to researchers who are interested in building research relationships with KBIC as a whole. And to that end, in each of these seasons, we provide some resources on where to find more information. And next slide, please. This brochure is available on the KBIC website, available for download for anyone who might be interested. So thank you so much, and I'll pass it on.
All right, so Val, I'm pretty sure you're up next, or maybe Kathy, you're up next. So if you want to say a few words, and I will get your slides brought up.
Minnow Gizhib. My name is Kathleen Smith. I'm in a new position with Great Lakes Indian Fish and Wildlife Commission. So as soon as we get my slides put up, so Ga Ganawangdan Manomen is actually in Ojibwe Mowin. It means she who takes care of the wild rice. And with that, with the new traditional knowledge that's coming about, especially with creating bridges, I guess, in a way to where it connects with science. So with, I'll get a little bit more into who exactly Glyphwick is, because this is like one of the things that kind of gets into bridging communities. So next slide, please. So who is Glyphwick? Glyphwick is actually formed in 1984, represents 11 Ojibwe tribes in Minnesota, Wisconsin, and Michigan. Member tribes reserve the right to hunting and fishing and gathering rights in the 1836, 1837, 1842, and 1854 treaties with the United States government. It also provides natural resource management, expertise, conservation enforcement, legal and policy analysis, and public information services in support of the exercise of treaty rights during well-regulated off-reservation seasons throughout the ceded territories. So, next slide. So the ceded territories are within the Great Lakes Basin. So the members are Mille Lacs, Danbury, which is located by St. Croix, Bad River, where Great Lakes Indian Fish and Wildlife Commission is located, in Odena, Wisconsin, Lac de Flambeau, Mole Lake, Lac-Courte, Fond du Lac, Red Cliff, Bay Mills, which is also in Michigan, Lac Vieux Desert, which is not too far from Baraga, Michigan. It's Waters Meet, Michigan, and Kuna Bay, that's where I'm enrolled. Next slide, please. So GLIFIC is actually governed by the Board of Commissions, which we are composed of a tribal chairperson from each member tribe or a designee, which ratifies the activities of what we do at the Great Lakes Indian Fish and Wildlife Commission. Also, we're governed by Voight Intertribal Task Force. It's composed of 10 members plus a chairperson. They address matters that affect treaty rights of the member tribes in the 1837 and 1842 ceded territories. We're also governed by the Great Lakes Fisheries Committee because a lot of our communities are actually deals with tribal fisheries. Next slide. So what are treaty rights? They're reserved for the GLIFIC member tribes, signed treaties in the 1836, 37, 42, and 54 with the United States government. In those treaties, they were sold land in the northern Michigan, Wisconsin, and Minnesota, but retained the rights to hunt, fish, and gather within those territories. Sometimes they're ignored when states assumed statehood and began regulating their own natural resources. They're affirmed in the mid-1900s, where the tribe sought legal affirmation of treaty rights. Several positive court decisions ensued in the Northwest and the Great Lakes region that affirmed treaty rights and ruled for self-regulation. So next slide. So exactly what do I do? So I work with Manomen. What is Manomen? Manomen is actually wild rice, and wild rice is located in the Manadu Gittigan, which is the spirit gardens. So wild rice is actually an annual aquatic plant grain. Manomen is an Ojibwe Mawin, which it translates as the good berry, and is known as a known medicine. Its cultural significance to the member tribes are part of our migration stories. They're play an integral part, in our feast foods and our ceremonies and community feasts that are held today. Anishinaabe utilizes grain for sustenance, and it also feeds our non-human relatives. Next slide. So with the GLIFIC Manomen program, which I'm a part of, I also focus on the preservation and enhancement of Manomen in ceded territory lakes. Annual aerial surveys are performed on existing beds to determine the density and overall health of rice beds. So we actually are grant derived through Bureau of Indian Affairs, and whatever grants that come about that will actually help us protect and enhance the resources that we have, and also, bring funding in to do research or surveys, and so that we can help community members protect their treaty rights also. So we also have select rice beds that are reseeded for enhancement and to reestablish the rice beds by restoration. Partners, we usually have, which are local, state, federal, tribal members and communities, universities, tribal colleges, you name it. We're the ones that actually bridge communities and bring people together. Next slide. So for example, some of our Manomen projects, we do a lot of education outreach. If I'm needed to go out and speak a lot with traditional knowledge, I also speak on environmental issues regarding traditional knowledge. I like to work with the youth a lot. We do a lot of wild rice restoration. We do have projects that are out there to where we acquire seed from serious vendors, and then we also go out and assist communities. And we also work with various stewardship plans. So there's actually stewardship plans. We like to call them stewardship instead of management plans, because management in the world of science is really one-sided, where we actually have a reciprocal relationship with a lot of our natural resources. So we like to call it stewardship because it's a reciprocal relationship that we have with the land, the water, all of our relatives. We also do research. We deal with a lot of universities. So as you could see that a lot of Emily's work and Val's work, who's coming up, that we do have a lot of relationships, because I used to work for Kuna Bay Indian Community in the Natural Resources Department. And that's where I worked with the habitat. We did Manomen restoration, the youth initiative. We did research. We did so many things. I usually wear a lot of hats. I also am an advocate for the water through our Anishinaabe water walks. We also have wild rice camps where, again, we have usually grant funds, and we have a lot of partners that we work with. It's a state. We have some that are coming up, this fall. Hopefully we'll be able to move forward. We are also part of some committees. I'm a part of the Wild Rice Committee, Manomen Committee, throughout the ceded territory, and help, protect that resource. So next slide. Wendam. As you can see, we have so much work to do. Working along with each other and building relationships is a great thing. So you can also reach out to Great Lakes Indian Fish and Wildlife Commission. We have an environmental section, wildlife, which I'm a part of, fisheries, interagency developmental affairs, which deal with a lot with policies, public information, and we have a branch for conservation wardens. So we deal a lot with treaty rights, tribal communities, and a lot of partners. So miigwech.
Miigwech, Kathy. So we're going to switch into the Q&A portion of the panel. So Susan's got some of the questions that we'll kick it off with.
Did we hear from Val already?
Not yet.
I am
On
jumping
standby.
ahead. Thanks, Val.
Yeah.
Saving the best for last. Don't tell the other panelists.
It's just between us. So thank you for the invitation to be here and share more about myself and the work that I do. And on the first slide here, you see a mixture of pronouns that might be new to some of you. And I just want to point out the idea of Ki and Ken really stems from Robin Wall Kimmerer's work. And it's the idea of kinship and kenning, and that we are relatives, not just human relatives, but also relatives to the fish and the trees and the water and all that is living across our landscape. Next. And of course, I'm more than just my work. I'm also just a partner, mother, sister, daughter, and auntie, and one half BFF. I adore my dogs. I love to garden and jam many different kinds of berries. I'm a community member and a writer and a scholar. I am a fish protector and also a water walker alongside many of my other co-panelists here today. And also I have academic roles at Michigan Tech at the College of Forest Resources and Environmental Science, and also the Great Lakes Research Center. My research is focused in many different directions, although they're very closely related. And so I often speak about the work that I do as the fish risk and health nexus to other researchers thinking about socio-ecological systems research, and also being inclusive of not just our human relatives, but more than human relations. And as Emily just beautifully shared about the seasons of research and thinking about research in times for to be working on different parts of our relationship and our work together. And finally, being very centered in bridging Western and Indigenous sciences, governance, and education. And through those differences, remaining distinct and having integrity, neither being better than the other, but in what ways can we share our different ways of knowing together. Next. And in thinking about this work that I've been a part of for a while with Great Lakes tribes in this region, I wanted to share just a few lessons for engaging with by-as research partnerships. Next. I would say if you're interested in doing partnership research, I always ask, above all, prioritize land and life. And this has to be thoughtful and intentional, and make these connections deliberate and evident to others. And there's many ways that we can do that and apply our institutional, academic, and also scientific tools and approaches specifically for the protection, restoration, and revitalization of land and life. Second, I ask people how important to think about, how well do you know your subject, your project, your stakeholders and rights holders, and also knowing yourself and how critical that is in doing partnership work. Sometimes we have different strengths and skills, but sometimes others, and inviting others into partnership. And finally, I'd ask to be humble. Humility and sometimes that vulnerability, being uncomfortable, is so important in being in partnership with others. And finally here, I just want to acknowledge where I am, right on the outskirts of the Keweenaw Bay Indian community. And I have compiled some resources on bridging Western and Indigenous sciences. And if you go to my profile page at mtu.edu, there'll be a link there that you can click for resources to share. So, Miigwech for inviting me. I look forward to the conversation.
Thank you all. And I'd invite everybody, just because Zoom meetings are so silent, if you wouldn't mind just unmuting and giving our panelists a round of applause. I would love to hear that joyful sound. So thank you all for that. That was a fantastic introduction to a conversation that we could spend, the next month working on, 24/7 and still feel like we're just scratching the surface. As I said in response to the opening video, and I think we'll drop the link to the full video there. Part of what I love about the East community is I'm learning something new every day. And I am a Great Lakes kid. I grew up a mile away from the Tuscarora Indian Reservation right between Lake Ontario and Lake Erie. And I'm really excited to learn more about the Lake Superior tribes and regions and species. So thank you for sharing that with us. As you all know, the Slido is open. The link is in chat, or it is in the Kiko chat space. So we've got a couple questions coming in there, but I thought I would start off our Q&A with just some questions for the panel as a whole. So in your experience, how should we prepare institutions to support relationship building of the nature that you all have described? And any of you can raise your hand or jump in or unmute, however you want to handle that.
I can speak to that. Oh, you can go. Go ahead.
Okay. So what you could do is you reach out to entities that you would like to build a relationship with. And if it is tribal, for instance, you can call up the tribal governments. And that way they will put into contact with who you would like to make connections with. Another would be the Tribal Historic Preservation Officer, or TIPO. You can go to the webpage for the tribes, to access this information. Also, if there's a natural resources department, especially if you want to dabble into the natural resources, and they will relay you to a contact within their office. So other ways that you could do is you can contact the local tribal colleges, because they will also make connections. And also the universities, like with Michigan Tech University, they do a lot of work with my community, the Keweenaw Bay Indian community. And so there's always somebody there like Val or Emily or Erica Vi at the Great Lakes Research Center that will connect you with our community. So there's various ways that you can go about doing that. The other ways, like Val had said in her presentation, make sure that when you make a presentation to tribal council that you're quick and to the point and what your intentions are. And what tribal council always, just loves to see the kind of work that, you can get involved in. So those are some of the ways that you can actually be a part of, some of the projects that you want to get involved with, and especially with, acquiring data, and make sure it's a reciprocal relationship to where tribal communities are able to also utilize that information in a good way. Also with Glyphwick, you can contact White Task Force by contacting Great Lakes Indian Fish and Wildlife Commission to actually get onto the agenda with anything that deals with the 11 tribes that I had mentioned within the Lake Superior. Always do your research ahead of time and get to know, the branches or who to make, connections with. And as this process does take time, you also takes time to approach tribal governments because, as it filters through and gets to where it needs to be to get on an agenda, that takes time because sometimes tribal governments, they will meet once a week where Voight Task Force meets once a month, but you can also get on the agendas in that way. So I just wanted to put that information out there because, going from tribal leadership to tribal communities, just be very patient, which.
Thank you, Kathy. Stephanie, did you want to add to that?
Yeah, I'd really like to build off of that. So my focus is on how do we prepare institutions to support researchers to do the good work that was just mentioned. And so I think there's some of the ways that were just said, and then we build those into policies and practices. So for instance, particularly educational institutions, but also federal institutions and others need to provide education and training on Indigenous peoples focused on local to global. So there's an understanding of the responsibilities to those who you live on their lands, but also the differences that you might encounter as you move up in scale. You need to look to expectations set by tribal governments and Indigenous communities, such as urban institutions. See, many of these already have research and data laws, so those and practices which may be written or unwritten. Or review processes set forth. And so we heard some of those from Val and from Kathleen. And I think this speaks to one of the questions that I saw in the Slido is that also when you begin to look at what tribal expectations are set, you can begin to find out what the commonalities are. There's a lot of commonalities across tribal expectations. So those help inform practices that may be done at a level where you're not just working with one community, but with many communities. And so we need to share these examples of promising tools, laws, policies, and practices that honor tribal sovereignty, rights, and responsibilities that institutions currently have. I've seen in my years of working where a lot of time institutions will allow researchers to do specific things like cede any rights to publication, but they don't talk about it. It's like a hidden practice. And if we don't make them visible practices, we don't begin to really set them into policy and practice for institutions and share those practices elsewhere. And then I think a couple other things is, really support Indigenous leaders and scholars within these institutions to be able to do the good work and provide leadership within whether we're talking about an education institution, a research institution, or a federal institution.
Great, thank you. Emily or Val, anything to build on?
Yes, thank you, Stephanie and Kathy, for your insights. I think one thing really important to acknowledge is that question, how do we prepare institutions? I think the short answer is we're still learning, right? Because they're all different communities and different institutions are different. And so it's not just about institutional partnerships, but we've heard it across the board here about personal relationships. That's where it starts, with personal relationships. You have to be a familiar name, a familiar face. Communities have different events that are going on in their own communities. Many of them have websites and community calendars, and what can you do to support the communities around you just as a person? Because I think that those relationships, the partnerships and the relationships you have with people should be the priority over the research partnerships or the data partnerships. So I think maybe that first question would be, how do you take a step into that relationship?
Great.
And I
Thank
think,
you, Gail.
oh, sorry, Susan.
No,
I was just
go
going to
ahead,
add, I think from my perspective as a student, I think one way that institutions can really make this kind of research more possible is by building this into timelines. I think of my timeline as a PhD student and the amount of pressure I felt to be working on creating this research guidance, yet still graduate on time and check all the boxes and do all my bean counting to get my degree. And I'm fortunate that I have advisors and committee members that were doing this before me. And so they individually understand the extension that this adds to my program. But when I talk to peers or administrators, it's sort of like, oh, you're only on chapter 2, da, 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 da. And it's because it took a year and a half to get this guidance together. And this guidance is what's governing the rest of my research. And it takes a lot of time to build those interpersonal relationships so that people or communities are interested in doing research with you.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I can say in any cultural connections, right? The understanding of relationships and time, that's like that foundational trust building step, I think, and if you come in with your agenda and looking to rush it, it's going to undermine you right from the start. I've definitely seen that. We have some great community questions coming in on Slido, so I'm going to pivot over to some of those with our first question from Brian Lee. Could you comment on data sovereignty issues? If a study requires data and information spanning across multiple tribal jurisdictions and navigating that, anyone like to weigh in on that?
So what we do at LIFWIC or even at the tribal level with Keweenaw Bay Indian community, sometimes, we have to make sure right from the get-go, if it's put into your grant for research, on how that research or that data can be relayed. So I took a class from Val, doing research subjects, for instance, or even interviewing. We have to be able to make sure that, there's agreement ahead of time to make sure that, this information can be shared in a way that, is able to really enhance your project and to be able to be shared outside of it also. So each tribe is different. White Task Force is different. Usually with our bosses that are part of that, they all have to be on the same page of how, certain data can be shared. There's a lot of sensitive data within our communities that, for instance, where I work with Manomen, so we have date regulated lakes. We have to kind of go through and make sure that some of these areas that can be shared are actually on our website. So with some of the data from the aerial surveys, that is, public information. So we make sure that it can be used ahead of time, to be able to share publicly. Some areas are protected, especially with each tribe within Glifook and the ceded territories. A lot of the lakes that are within tribal boundaries are actually regulated by the tribe themselves. So we don't have access to that information unless if they want to share that with us. So it's really a fine line, but it's, also about, building those relationships with individual tribes as well. So I just wanted to share that much. Meet you.
There are a couple questions that kind of build on that a little bit in Slido. So one is with reference to care principles. When data is released in open systems, it becomes hard to control access and use. And how can that be addressed? And then someone else's question was understanding criteria Can you help me understand criteria we could use to fix the metadata issues that were raised to make them more findable? Where would we look for such data? I guess those aren't quite as similar as I thought, but maybe let's start with the question on care principles. And I remember the first ESIP data stewardship call I was on, or maybe it was their presentation at the summer meeting, where I heard, looking at FAIR and looking at CARE and thinking, oh, yes, we need those to align, but it's not simple. It's not easy. There are really very careful things that need to be worked through in terms of access and being respectful of that. So Stephanie, can you maybe weigh in on that a little bit?
Sure. I think there's, so there's two things at issue. There's how do we care for or steward the data that already exists in these systems? And then there's how do we set up practices and policies that make sure that any new data we put into the system adhere to the responsibilities and the relationships that Indigenous people have with their data, right? And so they are sometimes overlap, but at the same time, they don't. I want to give an example. So, Kathy was talking about sensitive data, right? Well, for instance, the federal government holds a lot of sensitive data for tribes. Maybe they have in like an environmental impacts data statement, right? They have tribal names of sites that most tribal people don't even know yet. As the feds move towards digitizing all of that information, we need to be able to hold it back, right, until there's tribal approval there. This may seem tedious because sometimes you're going to go to a tribe and it's not going to be their priority to deal with that right yet. But it is the right way to go about doing it, especially for potentially highly sensitive information. And then the other thing I'm going to point out kind of relates to the other question too about metadata is that we need to begin to make space in our cyber infrastructure now for things like provenance, permissions, attribution, and protocols within. So this is kind of an extra legal way of dealing with the issues around who can share, how they can share, when it can be shared, right? And those are begin to create space within the system. So as we see NSF and all these other entities funding these new repositories and stuff, it's really important that we attend to the issues now and don't try to backdoor them later, right? So that the ethical responsibilities need to be handled up front, and not just for Indigenous people's data. Like once you start doing this work, you see how it really enriches the entire data system to be able to be responsible to not only Indigenous collectives, but other collectives, because a lot of peoples have interest in their data at a collective level, right? Versus just individual level. And so I'll leave that there and let other people make some comments.
Yeah, that was very well said, Stephanie. All those considerations are super important. And then you just think about across the many different Indigenous groups and tribal nations and First Nations. I mean, we're talking about a lot of work. One thing I think in thinking about all of what we're calling data is that who do these data belong to? And how can they serve the priorities of those people? And so we as a group of researchers may think about the ways that we can use that data and how we might be able to ask and answer different questions, but really, how can those different sets of data serve the communities that they actually belong to? And so sometimes we, I think, get ahead of ourselves and thinking about how we might be able to access and use different sets of data for our own benefit as researchers in different disciplines. And so much of this, that's a huge concern, as Stephanie brought up, about how much data is the federal government has, that doesn't belong to them, and again could make decisions potentially on behalf of other people who already are self-determined and have autonomy to make decisions on behalf of themselves. So I'll stop there and see if anybody else wants to add.
Kathy or Emily?
I don't know that my answer is so directly connected, just because in my experience, I'm really not working across communities or across data types. I'm thinking about it on a very like project specific basis. How do we think about data? And for me, it's connected to those seasons, how we share in our interpretation, and we share conversations throughout the research process, both in the planning and conception phase, but also in the interpretation phase. Like a part of my research, it's not going to be published until I've met with NRD and talked through these results and done this data interpretation in a way that is meaningful for them. And it's a little different because I'm using data that's available to everyone. It's from the EPA. And so it's not data collected locally. And this conversation is bringing up a lot of things that I hadn't considered before about how I do data sovereignty with this data that's been collected across the US, unresolved yet at this moment, but thinking about how that interpretation becomes meaningful to the communities that we're working with. And that comes from conversations and relationships.
Yeah, Emily, I wanted to share a couple questions that were, or comments in Slido. A lot of folks seem really like the way that you did your introduction on positionality. And we're wondering if you have any resources on how to learn to do that, if you might share them either in the chat or send them to Allison or I, and we can get them out to folks. And then a lot of folks, both you and Val, had the with by as statement for working with community. And I think that was new for me, and really appreciate you saying that and sharing that. I wanted to pivot a little bit here to a question, and I certainly feel this as I was working on my introductory remarks, you know, as I was watching the wildfires in Boulder last month, and, you know, the recent volcanic activity, and, you know, our world seems to have this sense of urgency, right? And, you know, certainly we saw our world catalyze really immediate action in regard to the pandemic and vaccines and development. So this work requires a long view of time. So do any of you have thoughts, and I know this is a really big question, on how do we cultivate that sensibility in a society that makes everything urgent and immediate? Because I know I fall into that all the time. Any thoughts on how we can act on such big problems with intentionality, while still maintaining maybe a little bit of that fire of urgency? Kathy's laughing. I want to know what you're thinking.
So, you know, being in the biological side, and plus, you know, I have a lot of teachings. You know, we have to connect back to our land. And, you know, all of our plant relatives, all of our animal relatives, you know, so even with Baboon, with winter upon us, you know, I fall back onto our teachings all the time. And so the month of January, it's supposed to be a time of listening, you know, so each month has a different teaching to it, you know. So sometimes we have to go back into ourselves and, you know, really think about how we walk upon this earth as our journey, you know, and where we kind of make these connections with our work and with research. And it kind of brought me back to this Manomen and Nibi conference I went to at White Earth Indian Reservation in Minnesota. And there it kind of brought about a lot of our traditional ecological knowledge holders and with science. So that what they did was they presented a lot about wild rice and Nibi, which is water. And so one of the questions that one of the elders had talked about was, you know, sometimes science has to prove things that Indigenous people already know. And so I really think about that, and and it's right. Sometimes we have to wait for the science world to catch up to the knowledge that is already withheld. But in order to prove certain things, we have to wait for the science portion of it. So that's how my position came about, because I'm supposed to link the culture with the biology, because they wanted a knowledge holder to be a part of this position that I now hold. Manomen, she who protects the wild rice. And so these positions are more and more so sought out. But to be able to have a position that's such as unique as mine, sometimes we have to sit and think about our work and how we bridge, these communities together, and to be able to advocate for our work. So if that makes sense, sometimes we have to sit and think and come into that present moment and think about our projects, think about the next 7 generations that we are responsible for, and how we can, have science be a big part of it, and the bridge, with the traditional knowledge holders. So also with that, it's just our time to take in and to make connections, because as humans, we always come into a virtual aspect, so we were able to overcome that. And so we can also look at it, through our eyes, but we also use all of our senses, our sense of smell, our taste, how we hear things, as we walk upon this earth. But we must just be able to think about these things and kind of reflect on our work that we do for Indigenous communities and for science. So hopefully I kind of answered that. Miigwech.
Thank you, Kathy. Anyone else want anything they want to add quickly before we move into some breakout rooms? Val.
I would like to share some things that I have learned from other members at the Keweenaw Bay Indian community about, this urgency that you brought up, and how urgent it is to slow down. And because there's so many decisions that are made quickly and in the short term. And Kathy brought up about the 7 generations philosophy, and you can read more about that in the Cliffwick strategic plan. And so it's interpreted in a handful of ways. So 7 generations into the future, or we right now, our current generation is in the middle. And so we make decisions in honor of the past, and in thinking and in consideration for the future. And so and Kathy brought up about, this is the time of reflection and listening. And so, yeah, we've been going fast for a long time. I don't know why we would want to continue that when it's gotten us into so much trouble. It's especially urgent to slow down.
Val, I really want to underscore what you said. I think it's really important. And I think particularly now during COVID, what we've seen is the raised level of urgency from outside entities pushing tribal communities to do things, particularly around data. For instance, NIH is trying to create a tribal data repository, and they're doing it without the full process that needs to be done to put this into place. And once you create something like that, like I said, without front dooring all of the responsibilities, you're going to come out with something that can be potentially seriously dangerous. And so we need to be able to do what Val said and really just understand that the urgency is really to slow down.
Excellent. How urgent it is to slow down. In every facet of my life, I need to keep that right here. So thank you. Thank you, all of you, for that. I really appreciate it. I want to keep these conversations going, and in true ESIP spirit, we love smaller conversations. Right now we have 132 people online. I think a couple people heard me say the word breakout rooms, and they headed for the hills. We were up over 150. If you're not comfortable moving into a breakout room or turning on your camera, that is okay. You can stay quietly and listen. We welcome that. Patty is going to open up our breakout rooms. Each of our speakers will be in one of those rooms. And let me pull up the questions in each. Sorry, one second. They were, Val is going to be, she is going to stay here in this main room. Her students in her class are online on YouTube, so they can be part of, listen in on that discussion. Val will be looking at reciprocity and what does reciprocity look like here in the main room. Stephanie will be talking more about repositories and what can repositories do. So I know there's a lot of ESIP folks who love that area. Kathy is going to be looking at tribal and agency work. How can partnerships honor traditional ecological knowledge? And Emily will have an early career focus. Where can early career researchers step in? So if you go at the bottom of your screen, you click on breakouts, you should be able to see Stephanie, Kathy, and Emily for those rooms. You can join those rooms and head on over there. And then anyone that wants to stay and chat with Val, you can stay here in the main room. Lots of great questions, and we will come back together for a quick wrap up before we send you off for the rest of your day. So head on over to those rooms.
Does Emily, Stephanie, and Kathy know which breakout room to go to?
I am putting them in each of those right now. Kathy, oh, good, Kathy's got it. And then those of you who are here, feel free to turn on your cameras. Let's see if I can find this one.
I'm sorry, I went to the bathroom and came back and we're all in breakout rooms.
Yes, welcome back. No problem. We have each of the speakers in their own breakout room. So Val is here in the main room talking reciprocity. Stephanie is talking about repositories. Kathy is talking about partnerships that honor traditional ecological knowledge. And Emily is talking about early career researchers. So if you know which one you want to go to, I can send you there if anyone is having trouble moving around. Or we can start the conversation with Val.
Yeah, I think I would like to just start out by saying, as someone who's coming to this ESIP space from the outside and not knowing about the organization, what a beautiful surprise to have like so many participants here. You know, I think the world of virtual participation has faded a little bit, but I think somebody forgot to tell ESIP folks, because it's like wonderful to see the participation.
We are really, really blessed with great people. Now, I'm going to applaud Marcel, my local farmers market buddy, who is a knitter, and I actually got to meet her in person. One of the first ESIP people I ever met. It's good to see you. And Shelly for turning on your cameras. Others, if you want to turn on your camera. Val, your topic was reciprocity. So maybe I'll get you started off in just, you know, I loved in the Seasons of Research booklet that Emily introduced. There were the 4 R's. There was reverence, respect, reciprocity, and responsibility. And I kind of dove into each one of those 4 words, and I just, oh, they're just so, they're rich, they're thick like maple syrup to me. So talk to us about kind of your thoughts on reciprocity and where you wanted to take that conversation.
Yeah, I would love to. I think that initially I want to acknowledge, you know, where those 4 R words came from. And it was a little citation on Emily's slide, but for those of you who want to check out the Indigenous Science Statement, which was part of the March for Science, and then more, I believe it's more than 1,000, it could be closer to 2,000 now, Indigenous scholars put out a statement, an Indigenous science statement, that it's not just the March for Science, but it's the March for Sciences. that there are many ways of knowing, and many Indigenous people may not be doing Western science, but they're certainly doing science. So reciprocity is one of those, and there are many different ways to think about reciprocity. And in my research and my teaching and my service, all of that is really tied closely together. And also thinking about perhaps a time scale and not putting on a time scale to that, that it's about giving and receiving, but not being overly concerned with the time between those. So starting out as a graduate student, I was already thinking about wanting to be seen more as a giver than a receiver. And I think for those of you who are considering research partnerships with communities, Indigenous or otherwise, how do you want to be seen? Because as researchers, we walk into these places with all the baggage of bad researchers on us. So what can you do to shed that? I think should be really at the forefront of your mind. And so I already had a good idea that research, there's a saying from the scholar Smith, Linda Smith, about research is a bad word and a bad name in Indigenous communities. And so having that understanding, how do you want to be seen right from the start? And what can you do to shed off some of that? Is definitely be seen as a giver of your time, of your expertise. Sometimes you're just an extra set of hands. Sometimes you're just another participant attending community events. There's all different ways to be involved in our communities, and many of you, I imagine, already are. So. Are there any thoughts or questions anyone wanted to share about reciprocity or examples of reciprocity?
Shelley.
I feel so, this is so hard to talk about. So I'm feeling very uncomfortable. But I also feel very, I don't know, the word responsible is not quite right. Maybe you can help me with that word. But I feel like I should actively look for opportunities to repair. And yeah, I don't quite know what that looks like. And I don't quite know, I mean, I know it's not me, but it's my history. Mm-hmm. And I have a lot of relatives. I have a lot of friends. No doubt harm has been done. Mm-hmm. How do I approach what I can do, what I can influence to where it's wanted? Like if I knocked on your door and say, hey, I'd like to spend the rest of my afternoon talking to you because I feel really bad about, I mean, I really don't think that's priority for you. So, but maybe that's not it. Maybe it's benefiting a community in a way that is, I don't know. I need help here.
Yeah, I really hear you. So I think there's something in the way that, our own approaches that we're taught, you got to be doing something or you're not doing anything kind of thing. And yet I think you're not, you said that word, responsibility. I think that you're thinking about, you feel obligated. You feel this obligation, whether it was you, but it is all of our history, right? And you feel something that you need to repair. I think many times, and there's that urgency again, we want to jump in, with 2 feet and your work boots on, and but you haven't done your homework. And that's why I started collecting all these different resources. And if you have a chance to explore them, there are probably a few hundred different links. And most of them are podcasts and webinars and stories. And it's not a collection of academic articles. What I really was trying to elevate and highlight were the voices of communities, Indigenous communities, or in some way, minority communities, marginalized communities, but those groups do have a voice, and they are putting out information. They're sharing really important insights about what we can all do. But the first one is definitely do our homework by listening, by learning, invest in that. And so when you are in a place where you're actually in action, you're not making mistakes and stepping in the wrong places, or the wrong words are falling out of your mouth. You can, and also about being uncomfortable, and we are supposed to be uncomfortable. I don't know why as humans we think that we're so smart, but we're not. It's okay to be vulnerable. We are one of the most vulnerable species on the planet, right? The rocks and the plants and the trees, and they've been here much, much longer. They're much wiser than we are. And so looking to those other beings for lessons. I once heard Robin Wall Kimmerer talk about a difference between Western science and Indigenous science is that Western sciences are trying to learn about rivers or about forests, and Indigenous scientists and just people are learning from what can we learn from the water? What can we learn from the trees? I'm always trying to figure out what can I learn from the fish who I do want to protect, but they really have lessons for us because they are doing their work to protect us as well. And so it's a different kind of listening. I hope that helped for you to take up some of that obligation that we all have. It is becoming everybody's work. Not just, isolated for a few people. It is becoming all of our work.
Thank you. That's really, really helpful.
Great.
And I will share that in our first conversation about shaping this plenary, Val challenged me right off the bat and gave me a wonderful list of resources to start my homework journey. And I will make sure that we find the right place to share those out to everyone else, because I've just started digging, and as soon as it's like anything, it's one layer, and then you want to go another layer deeper and another layer deeper, and we don't want this to just be, wow, that was a great opening plenary. How does this influence our work together going forward? Shelley?
Can I, I'm trying, my core self wants to jump at something I knew I've learned, right? But your words earlier about slowing down are what I'm hearing in my head. So I'm both jumping and slowing down, but it's working well with each other. Susan and I are not very far apart, and I guess Marseille is not far from either of us either. So our land is similar, and the Indigenous peoples that are here are similar. And I did look, not today, but some time ago, a few months ago, to learn if the peoples are still here, or if there's something that I could look at and understand better. and there is some evidence, and I, you know, when I'm trying to experience communities, this pandemic has really helped because everybody went on Zoom and you could lurk and you could watch and you could listen. And I wonder, I suppose that doing that without, that you would need, if you were interested in trying to understand a community, you would have to ask permission to lurk. I wouldn't want to make someone nervous that you were, I mean, not that I would have access to a Zoom account or anything without asking for it, but I feel as if I would need an invitation. Oh, that was said earlier, you know, we can't study a community without being invited to study a community. We should not eavesdrop on a community without being invited to eavesdrop. And I just hope I have the courage to go ask.
Yeah, but you can certainly learn from the information that they're already sharing, that's already out there. And I really appreciate Simon's notes in there about the organizations, and ESIP can reach out and have a table, an outreach table. ESIP can sponsor students and fellowships and travel, you know, for things that you want to learn more from Indigenous students in higher education. And, you know, the numbers aren't great, so hearing from them is especially important, right? And there is work out there already being done about what are some of the barriers, the systemic barriers, and what can ESIP do to be a bridge, you know, and make those pathways less challenging for students. So there's all kinds of ways that people can help. I see Susan. Simon has his hand up.
Yep, Simon.
Hey, thanks. I just, this is great. I just wanted to add that the groups like SACNAS and ACES have large annual conferences, although obviously that situation has changed lately, but they're very well attended. They have a large presence and generally tend to be very active on social media as well. And so there's lots of opportunities, I think, like Shelley was saying, to sort of listen in. And I guess one of the big things I've found is that I made a real effort in my social media, largely my Twitter, to make an effort to follow First Nations scholars, Indigenous scholars, depending on where they're from. And it really makes a big difference in terms of the information that you get from those communities. And so for me, I think my experience about what First Nations people are doing on Twitter and in the sciences is very different from what a lot of people's is, simply because I follow those people and I make an effort to listen and to curate my stream of information. And I strongly encourage people to do that, because there are lots of people out there doing really cool work about decolonizing geospatial information, about thinking about the way that we think about information and schemas and things like that from a perspective of decolonization and from a perspective of First Nations rights. And yeah, I think it's just part of it is just informing ourselves that that information exists.
Yeah. Yeah, I really appreciate that, Simon. And as a person who doesn't do much social media, and I would say there are some people here like that as well, but I'm on a ton of different email lists, and the wave of information out there, I mean, that's pretty much how I put those resources together, that, you know, I registered for different events. I mean, yes, the pandemic has many challenges, and I'm not going to minimize that at all, but it also made so much information accessible in talks and conferences that I wouldn't have been able to attend in person. Some of like this here, right? I don't know if I could have accepted this invitation if it wasn't available online. So the social media, that's huge, right? I love how Simon said he curated his flow of information. And I think you can do the same thing by joining different email lists or different organizations in that way as well.
We have about 1 more minute. Oh, wow. It's like I seriously didn't push that button. We have about 1 more minute. Anybody else have a specific question for Val or a reaction to the conversation?
I do want to.
Oh, go ahead. I was going to say silence can be awkward, but sometimes if I force it, it challenges someone to speak up.
One thing I just wanted to add, and this really comes from Shelley's comments and Simon, and thinking about, you know, feeling uncomfortable and how the space can be new and intimidating. And something I share with other researchers and my students many times is that it is true, you know, that we are in different places, but we have to think of it that we're all on the same pathway. And so that is really critical, that I have so much more to learn. I've been on the pathway for a time, but I still have so much more to learn. I think if we're always thinking about our learning as incomplete, our circles of kin are always incomplete. I'm still, you know, thinking about decolonization and indigenizing our research and our thinking. There's something always shifting in my head, you know, and it's all a part of this pathway. And so if you feel that you're on it, welcome. And we need to think of ourselves in that way, but that also means our work is never done.
Absolutely. Perfect timing. It looks like the other rooms have closed. So I'm seeing lots of people pop back in here. It looks like we're up to 83, 84 people. Thank you all. Thank you to our panelists for your time and your thoughts. Thank you to all of you who asked questions and voted up questions. It's a real honor to have you all here with us this morning. So before I send you out, in Kiko Chat, in that space, one of the things we like to do is to capture the 3 takeaways from each session. So as you all know, with 4 breakout rooms, we can't be everywhere at once. And that's one of the biggest regrets I hear from people at ESIP meetings is, I can't be everywhere at once. So I would encourage you to go into the 3 takeaways document in this plenary space in Kiko Chat and let us know what your 3 takeaways from this session were, either from the breakout conversations or from the conversations that we had as part of the main plenary. That helps us distill what really resonated with the community. If this is work oh, another room just came. Sorry, I started my wrap up. For those of you who just joined, I was saying, please go to the Kiko Chat space and help us distill your 3 takeaways from this conversation, and actually from each session that you're in this week, so that we can understand what parts of the conversation resonated most with each of you. For those of you that are really engaged in this topic and want to dig in more, I invite you to connect with our Sustainable Data Management Cluster. I see a number of faces from that group on, and they are working hard in this area, especially as it relates to FAIR and CARE principles. But then I asked the question of, this work just doesn't need to just reside in one cluster. So where else are we feeling called in our work to live more into this work, and how might we take this conversation even fuller into our meeting in Pittsburgh in July? So I challenge you with all of that. As for the rest of the day and the rest of our meeting, I neglected to open and thank our sponsors. ESIP meetings could not happen without meeting sponsorship, and I'm really exceptionally grateful to Microsoft, to Element 84, and to AGU as our meeting sponsors for our January meeting this year. A couple of things coming up. I hope that you enjoy this afternoon's breakout sessions. There are some really great content to go explore. We will have our coffee networking break. Whenever you see coffee networking break, that's your signal that we actually have our networking room open. We consistently hear that the thing you miss most is the networking time. So show up. As I said, we have 96 first-time attendees and 300 people in total. So show up to our coffee break and also this evening our happy hour. This is our one later night for those of you on the East Coast of the US. We would love to see you there to have those fun connections and conversations that are a little bit harder to do in the business part of the meeting. So we're looking forward to a great rest of the day today. Coffee break, evening happy hour, and hope to see you all there. And thank you again to our panel.